At 0712 on May 18, 1944, over a low gray morning sky near the Baltic coast, a single P-51 Mustang touched down in a meadow with the kind of awkward grace that betrayed a pilot forced to improvise. The man who saw it first was Hauptmann Dieter Krause, a Luftwaffe test pilot temporarily assigned to a salvage detachment, and he did not smile. He walked forward through the dew with boots that had seen too many runways and too few quiet fields, and found the aircraft mostly intact but silent. Its Packard Merlin engine still warm to the touch, and its cockpit open, as if the occupant had simply stepped out. The gauges on the instrument panel were frozen at odd readings, oil pressure low and coolant temperature higher than the needle should ever be. Krause understood at once that this was not merely a downed enemy fighter. It was an opportunity and a problem, two things that demanded different kinds of decisions at once. He radioed for a recovery crew, and as men arrived to strip batteries and drain fuel, he formed a thought that would not let go. What would happen if his own engineers could listen closely enough to that Merlin heart to reimagine aerial combat? The scene of recovery was clinical and urgent at once. Lieutenant Fritz Horst led the salvage team, a lean man with grease still under his nails from dawn maintenance, and he ordered the plane cordoned and photographed. Johann Schmidt, a mechanic from the Feldwerkstatt detachment, placed his palm on the radiator housing and frowned. The radiator had been modified, tubing rerouted, and there were small shims where none should have been. Oberst Helmut Berger arrived with a notebook, his face the color of official trouble, and issued immediate orders. Secure the aircraft, document every component, transport the airframe to Fliegerversuchsstelle No. 3 for a formal evaluation. The meadow smelled of wet earth and fuel and the distant salt of the sea. Men worked with flashlights and canvas, cutting straps and loosening bolts, while a captured map and a torn navigation log lay on the passenger seat, inked in English with cramped script and stamped with mission times. Initial hypotheses fluttered like birds: battle damage, navigational error, engine failure. But the pattern of small modifications around the oil cooler suggested something more deliberate. The recovery team took photographs, made sketches, and, above all, kept hands off anything that looked like it might carry secrets. The mood was equal parts exultant curiosity and nervousness. A machine intact in enemy hands meant intelligence or embarrassment, depending on what the papers found. Krause watched the operation, feeling the weight of responsibility settle onto a chest that still bore the memory of lost comrades. He thought of the theoretical work he had read as a young pilot about laminar flow wings and cooling efficiency, and realized that this Mustang might be a practical answer to arguments fought in engineering rooms and flight logs. Moving the Mustang from the meadow to the test facility was a study in logistics and secrecy. The road convoy crawled in the gray light, trucks masked with tarps and escorted by armored cars, and the transport route avoided major towns. Inside the belly of a flatbed truck, the Mustang looked smaller and more intimate than any photograph could show, its fuselage humming faintly from residual heat, its ailerons and flaps tied down, its canopy streaked with dew. At the Fliegerversuchsstelle, a low industrial complex of hangars and instrument rooms, the plane was unloaded under the watchful eyes of engineers and security officers. Dr. Klaus Weber, the chief aerodynamicist, met Krause near the hangar door with a clipboard and an intensity reserved for cold technical problems. He introduced a roster of specialists who would become the inner circle. Ingrid Mayer, an instrumentation technician with a talent for sensor placement. Hans Vogel, a contraband-oriented test pilot who had flown captured machines before. Marta Rulé, a metallurgist who tracked alloy composition like a detective, and Captain Otto Brandt, a liaison officer responsible for paperwork and strict procedures. The facility smelled of oil, hot metal, and coffee. Fluorescent lights threw sharp glints on the Mustang's polished skin. Workers photographed rivets and seams, removed inspection plates, and stowed samples. There was a small crowd of observers from the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, faces blank with both hope and dread. The hangar itself was an organism of instruments and charts, altimeters and tachometers, and a small anechoic booth where radio frequencies could be isolated. Krause briefed the assembled team on what he had seen in the field and what the salvage crew had documented. Dr. Weber listened and then, quietly, said that before any flight there would be a careful walk-around, a battery of bench tests on the Packard Merlin, and a full instrumentation plan to record speed, altitude, manifold pressure, oil pressure, RPM, and temperatures at multiple points. If the Mustang offered a different calculus of performance, they would not find out by guessing. They would find out by measuring. The inspection and bench testing consumed hours that felt like days. Krause performed the walk-around himself with the methodical eye of a man trained to read a machine like a newspaper. He opened the cowling and looked into the heart of the Packard Merlin, and then into the labyrinth of radiators mounted along the belly and in the wing roots. He tapped the trailing edge of the wing near the aileron and felt for unusual flex. He smelled the faint residue of lubricants and a sweet metallic trace that Marta Roulet would later identify as a different antifreeze compound mixed into the coolant. The crew removed panels and logged serial numbers. They discovered that the oil cooler had been relocated, that the radiator ducting used a narrower aperture with a smooth inlet fairing, and that the pilot's harness had been reinforced with an aftermarket clasp not typical of production Mustangs. Hans Vogel, the pilot assigned to perform the first control checks, read the logbook and then the cockpit instruments under bright lamps. He said nothing for a long moment and then offered an exchange of small sentences with Krause and Dr. Weber. Krause asked how it felt from the pilot's seat. Vogel answered that ergonomically the cockpit was familiar, but the trim tabs had been set in a way that made initial roll response unusually quick. Dr. Weber noted that the angle of incidence at the wing root showed slight modification. Marta Roulet sent rivet samples to a lab. Ingrid Mayer wired strain gauges to the wing spar and set up pitot-static probes for the upcoming taxi and low-speed runs. The first engine bench runs recorded the Merlin turning at normal RPM but delivering slightly higher manifold pressure at sea level than contemporaries, a discrepancy of about 3 to 4 psi that could translate into a meaningful advantage in power. Every test was recorded, every oddity cataloged, and a dossier began to form that read like a layered argument. This was not a single improvement, but a suite of small modifications that together might tilt performance. When the pilot's inspection ended and the pre-flight checks were complete, the decision to fly for an initial evaluation rested with Krause and Dr. Weber. The cockpit was closed and instruments aligned. Hans Vogel buckled in and spoke aloud the routine checks in a voice that steadied the room. He voiced the throttle advance, the magneto check, the oil pressure climb, the RPM rise to 2700 and then to 2850, and the consensus was that the Mustang, though foreign in many marks, responded with the crispness of a well-balanced machine. The taxi was cautious. The Mustang breathed into life, and the hangar echoed with a sound like a living thing. Field observers lined the perimeter as the aircraft accelerated along the field and lifted into a low climb. The first test profile was simple: steep turns at 10 to 15-degree bank, power-on climbs to 10,000 feet, and speed runs at low level under radar observation. Vogel reported back over the intercom with clipped sentences as each maneuver concluded. In the air, he described the feeling of roll rate, the sensitivity of rudder at moderate angles, the absence of adverse yaw he had expected in a clipped wing. Communications were terse and measured and formed a dialogue between pilot and ground that ran longer than a typical pre-flight exchange. At one point, when Vogel pushed to a higher manifold pressure setting to test acceleration, Krause called over the ground radio and asked about oil temperature. Vogel answered that it rose less than expected and that the carburetor and supercharger response felt immediate. Dr. Weber's face, observed through binoculars from the ground, held a slow concentration that suggested a new hypothesis forming. The test flight itself became the heart of the investigation, an exercise in controlled observation and technical translation. Over the course of the sortie, the aircraft was taken through a catalog of maneuvers designed to map its envelope. Vogel pushed to 380 miles per hour in a shallow dive, reported a steady RPM reading at 3,000, and a manifold pressure that sustained higher than comparable fighters of similar displacement. At 10,000 feet, the supercharger two-stage arrangement held manifold pressure much more effectively than expected, giving higher power at altitude where many Allied engines lost vigor. The Mustang's laminar flow wing, paired with the Merlin, produced a glide and acceleration that felt less drag-bound and more thrust-driven. Sensory details were vivid. The roar in the cockpit was a living ocean, a metallic chorus that shifted as throttle and mixture were adjusted. The vibration was present but not alarming, a controlled pulse through the control column and into the palms. The smell of warm oil and hot air through the vents was constant. Vogel felt the control surfaces respond with a precision that suggested stiffened actuators and near-perfect balance of mass and aerodynamic center. In one simulated disengagement, when Vogel retarded throttle rapidly to test instantaneous deceleration, the aircraft recovered with little buffet, the flaps and ailerons holding crisp authority. During a flat turn at 300 miles per hour, the Mustang did not show the stall tendency that had baffled other designs at similar loads. Data logged during the flight showed higher speed at comparable engine output, reduced drag coefficients in the recorded post-flight plots, and thermal traces indicating improved heat rejection from the modified radiators. On the ground, the engineers leaned over printouts and spoke in technical tones, turning human awe into numbers. The comparison to their own fighters was stark, and the conversation shifted from curiosity to tactical implication. 2 moments of acute tension punctuated the testing and required extended description. The first occurred on the third sortie, when a small fuel leak manifested as a faint sweet odor and a drop in pressure. The call came from Vogel in the air, and the hangar snapped to procedures. Radios were alive with clipped commands. Vogel declared intention to land and executed a long approach with checklist recited under his breath. The landing was firm, and the team rushed to the aircraft with fire extinguishers and inspection lamps. For nearly 6 minutes, there was a thick silence, broken only by the hiss of cooling metal and the breathing of men who had watched too many controlled experiments end badly. Marta Rula crouched and pressed her face near the wing root and found a pinhole in a fuel line. She described the sound and smell, and then the tiny relief when the leak was sealed and the aircraft was deemed safe. The detailed tense interval that followed was a study in discipline, protocol, and human fragility. The second critical moment came during a high-speed run when an instrument recorded a transient spike in oil temperature while manifold pressure remained steady. For 10 heartbeats, the engineers considered the possibility of bearing failure and the test was aborted. The Mustang returned and was wheeled into the hangar with mechanics already prepared for the worst. Technicians removed the sump and found metal filings in a filter housing. That discovery forced a deeper investigation into lubrication pathways and pump geometry. Both moments required multiple paragraphs of concentrated attention because they showed how small anomalies could change conclusions and how human vigilance prevented catastrophe. Approximately 1/3 of the way through the experiment and after the initial battery of sorties, the channel to the public and to peers required a deliberate pause to engage the audience. If you were surprised that a captured fighter could reveal so much by its components and setup, leave a comment now. What do you think was more decisive for aerial advantage? Top speed, operational range, or maneuverability? Start your answer with speed, range, or maneuver to help others follow the thread. The best comments shape future episodes, and we read them. Now back to the hangar where the analysis resumed and answers began to accumulate. The report that emerged from Fliegerversuchsstelle No. 3 was methodical, dense, and politically combustible. It summarized instrumentation data and human testimony, and it translated sensor traces into operational language that commanders could understand. The chief conclusions noted that the Packard Merlin installation in the Mustang, combined with careful attention to radiator ducting and an efficient laminar flow wing, produced a fighter that could cruise at higher speeds with less power penalty and could sustain altitude where many contemporaries began to fall behind. The report included specific numbers. Cruise at 320 miles per hour at 15,000 feet was achievable with conservative manifold pressure settings. Top speed at low altitude registered near 380 miles per hour in shallow dives, and climb rate exceeded some domestic designs by several hundred feet per minute. Fuel consumption at high tower settings still limited range, but the Mustang's internal tank arrangement and external modifications allowed for extended mission durations in practical profiles. The dossier contained photographs, material analysis from Marta Rula showing a slightly higher percentage of chromium in critical alloys, Pateau readings and corrected drag coefficients, and a set of recommended changes to their own designs that ranged from practical radiator rerouting to reconsideration of wing contouring. The report was sent to the Reichsluftfahrtministerium and to selected group commanders. Reactions varied from skepticism to grudging admiration. Some officers argued that the Mustang's superiority was context-dependent and that in rough weather or improvised fields the design had vulnerabilities. Others, including Oberst Berger, warned that if the Mustang did confer a consistent advantage, then training and tactics would need to shift. A confidential demonstration was organized for a small group of fighter wing leaders who watched the footage and heard the numbers and left the hangar in a mood of unsettled reassessment. Backstories enriched the narrative of those involved and explained why this particular evaluation had meaning beyond a single test. Hauptmann Dieter Krause had been a city boy who, at age 16, had built gliders from scrap in a workshop behind his parents' bakery. He had trained as an aeronautical apprentice before joining the Luftwaffe and had kept a private notebook of aerodynamic notes that he consulted often. His background in both hands-on maintenance and theoretical aerodynamics made him skeptical of quick conclusions and meticulous in documentation. That personal history of curiosity had propelled him into salvage units and test flights and had made him restless in the face of an unexplained advantage. Hans Vogel, the test pilot, had survived a forced landing over the channel and learned to fly anything that could lift. He had a reputation for calm radio voice and an intuitive feel for stall margins. Dr. Klaus Weber had spent 10 years in university research on laminar flow and had lost funding repeatedly when priorities shifted. For him, the Mustang represented a vindication of ideas pursued in academic solitude. Marta Rula had come from a mining family and had trained in metallurgy, where she learned to read the story metals told about heat treatment and stress. Fritz Horst had been a frontline mechanic before being reassigned and knew how to make a damaged machine fly again. Ingrid Mayer had been a radio operator once and had a knack for coaxing consistent data from temperamental sensors. Otto Brunt had mastered bureaucracy and navigated permissions where others met closed doors. Each backstory ran about the size of a paragraph, and together they formed a mosaic of expertise that explained how the machine was not only analyzed but understood. The main protagonist's backstory extended further. Krause's apprenticeship and his private notes about boundary layer control totaled nearly 1,000 characters and clarified why he later argued for specific aerodynamic adaptations in training manuals. The immediate tactical implications rippled outward. Commanders began to ask whether escort doctrine should be revised and whether fighter formations should change altitude profiles to account for differences in climb and cruise. Technical recommendations moved toward practical outcomes. Improve radiator inlets to reduce drag. Consider composite fabrication and control surfaces for better stiffness to weight ratios. And prioritize pilot training on exploiting sustained high speed at altitude. The confidential report spurred a limited program of reverse engineering and small-scale production trials. Engineers sketched prototypes, procurement officers opened files on material suppliers, and maintenance crews practiced modifications on training airframes. Some units quietly adopted new instructions about approach speeds and climb profiles. The intelligence community also circulated the report with caveats, comparing the Mustang's performance to contemporary domestic designs and to a captured sample of other Allied fighters.
The debate between confirmation and counter-argument played out in briefings and coffee rooms, sometimes heated and sometimes resigned. The final epilogue unfolded in 3 temporal moments that show transformation on the human, technical, and strategic planes. 1 month after the tests, the salvage team returned to the field where the Mustang had landed to collect overlooked components and to re-enter the small pile of
personal effects for preservation and study. The men spoke in softer tones and recorded small items, preserving both technical artifacts and the memory of an enemy pilot who had likely bailed to save his life. The immediate mood was pragmatic and reflective, and a short record circulated among engineers about the field conditions that had produced the emergency landing. 3 months later, the first round of experimental adaptations had moved from drawing board to workshop. Prototype radiators received new ducting, and a small number of training aircraft incorporated adjusted flap schedules and revised trim tabs. Flight schools updated briefings, and pilots began to practice new climb profiles that exploited the lessons learned from the Mustang evaluation. Engineers documented performance gains in revised charts, and the changes quietly filtered into operational practice. 6 months onward, the ripples became strategy. Tactics documents were amended to emphasize energy management at altitude and to caution against head-on intercepts that left pilots vulnerable to the Mustang's sustained speed. Production notes circulated about potential material substitutions that could be implemented at scale, and procurement opened limited trials for components that mirrored the captured modifications. The long-term effect was not instantaneous dominance, but a strategic recognition. Machines taught lessons, and sometimes they demanded adaptation. The human consequence was palpable. Krause, Vogel, and their team were commended in private memorandums for their rigor and discretion. Their names entered reports and training manuals as the men who had listened to a captured engine and allowed its murmurs to change doctrine. The story closed with a short reckoning. A single plane, an engine, a set of altered ducts, and a pilot with steady hands had shifted conversations from assumption to evidence. It was a lesson in humility and in the stubborn power of engineering to alter outcomes. Sometimes a machine spoke louder than a general, and when listened to, it could change the map of aerial combat. If you want more of these examinations that mix people and precision, subscribe and tell us which detail surprised you most.